Imagine you're driving on a freshly paved highway, the weather's clearing up, the engine is humming, and, you're making fantastic time.
Right. You finally feel like the worst part of your journey is basically behind you.
Exactly. And that was essentially the global economy at the dawn of 2026. I mean, we were riding this unparalleled technology and artificial intelligence investment boom.
Yeah. Global trade tensions were actually showing signs of easing up for once.
Right. And financial conditions were pretty accommodating. Growth was holding remarkably steady. And then on February 28th, a catastrophic multi-car pileup happens right in the middle of the only bridge out of town.
And that pileup, it forced the International Monetary Fund to just completely tear up their economic rulebook overnight.
Mhm.
I mean, instead of issuing their standard spring forecast, they released this highly anticipated and, frankly, really ominous new report.
Yeah, titled Global Economy in the Shadow of War.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand where the global economy is heading, we have to look at the exact mechanism of that February shock.
We do.
We need to, move away from overarching economic theory for a second and look at the physical reality of global trade, specifically the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, because if you really want to understand global economic vulnerability, you have to study choke points. And the Strait of Hormuz is, well, it's arguably the most critical maritime bottleneck on the entire planet.
Wow.
To put the scale into perspective here, the IMF report details that normally about 20 million barrels per day of oil flow through that specific corridor.
Wait, 20 million every single day?
Every single day.
Yeah.
That represents roughly 20% of daily global oil consumption.
Yeah.
All of it squeezing through just one, narrow geographic passage.
So, think of global trade like this colossal, highly automated warehouse, right?
Oh,
The shipping lanes are the conveyor belts moving critical components to the assembly lines. And the Strait of Hormuz is basically the primary exit door for the entire energy sector.
that's a great way to look at it.
Right, so when a major conflict suddenly barricades that door, the whole warehouse just grinds to a halt. The assembly lines are completely starved of fuel, and the cost of whatever inventory is left on the shelves just skyrocket.
And the disruption on February 28th, I mean, it severed a staggering volume of that energy supply. The conflict immediately curtailed about 8.5 million barrels per day of crude oil exports.
Jeez.
Yeah. Removing that much supply from the global market instantly, and I mean, instantly alters the economic calculus for nearly every nation on Earth.
Right.
And, it's not just crude oil either. The flow of natural gas was also severely compromised.
Yeah, the natural gas numbers in the IMF report are just jarring. I mean, almost immediately, European natural gas prices spiked by 61%,
Right.
and Asian liquefied natural gas, or LNG, that surged by 80.6%.
Which is massive.
But here's the bizarre part to me. The report notes that United States natural gas prices barely moved at all. They rose only about 4.9%. So if energy is a globally traded commodity, why didn't the U.S. feel the same immediate pain as Europe and Asia?
Well, because the global energy market is ultimately constrained by physical infrastructure.
Yeah.
I mean, to ship natural gas across an ocean, you can't just pump it into a standard cargo hull.
Right, it's gas.
Exactly. You have to cool the gas down to roughly minus 260 degrees Fahrenheit until it condenses into a liquid. Then, you load it onto these highly specialized cryogenic ships.
Wow, okay.
And the U.S. has abundant domestic gas reserves, sure, but the coastal facilities required to freeze and load that gas, those LNG export terminals, they were already operating at their absolute maximum limit.
Oh, I see. So even if buyers in Asia were totally desperate and willing to pay, double the price, the U.S. simply couldn't physically push more gas out the door.
Precisely. That physical bottleneck kept the gas trapped domestically, which, insulated U.S. prices. But for the rest of the world, paying that 80% premium, it acts as a severe economic contagion.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, an energy crisis is fundamentally an inflation crisis because energy is the invisible base layer of the entire economy.
It's the core ingredient in literally everything you buy. I mean, it powers the fertilizer plants that grow your food. It fuels the cargo ships, the delivery trucks that bring goods to your local stores.
Exactly. And prior to February, the IMF was tracking a very encouraging global disinflation trend.
Right. Things were looking good.
Yeah. Central banks were finally getting rising prices under control. But when energy spikes like that, those costs bleed into agricultural production, manufacturing, logistics. It threatens to entirely derail all the progress we made against inflation over the last 3 years.
And because that energy choke point is highly unpredictable, the IMF couldn't just offer one singular prediction for the rest of the year, could they?
No, they really couldn't.
The report actually lays out three distinct paths for the global economy, and it depends entirely on how long the blockade lasts.
Yeah, they had to abandon their traditional baseline projection because the geopolitical situation is just too fluid. So instead, they provided a reference forecast alongside two increasingly severe downside scenarios.
Let's walk through these paths because this is important. Path number one is the reference forecast, which basically assumes the conflict is relatively short-lived. But even in this optimistic scenario, a lot of economic damage has already been done, right?
Unfortunately, yes. Under this reference forecast, the IMF projects global growth will dip to 3.1% for 2026.
Which is down from what?
It's down from their pre-conflict projection of 3.4%. And simultaneously, global headline inflation bumps up to 4.4%. So it represents a noticeable deceleration of economic progress and basically a stall in the fight against the cost of living.
But if the conflict drags on, we move to path two, which is the adverse scenario.
Right. And the adverse scenario assumes the conflict restricts supply long enough to drive oil prices up by 80%.
Wow.
In this environment, global growth drops to 2.5% and inflation climbs to 5.4%.
And then there's the third path, the severe scenario. This assumes lasting damage to Middle Eastern energy infrastructure. In this projection, oil prices increase by 100% and natural gas jumps by 200%. The IMF warns that global growth would plummet to 2% and inflation would cross the 6% threshold.
Which is terrifying because a 200% increase in natural gas would paralyze heavy industry across Europe and Asia. Just shut it down.
Okay, I have to push back a little on this underlying pessimism, though.
Okay, sure.
Because on paper, 2% global growth still sounds like forward momentum. Furthermore, wait, didn't the global economy just survive a massive inflation and supply chain shock during the pandemic recovery?
We did, yeah.
We managed to navigate that without a total systemic collapse. Aren't we more resilient now? Why is the IMF sounding the alarm so urgently this time around?
It's a fair question, but when you factor in global population increases, 2% global growth is functionally a per capita recession.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. On the ground, it translates to widespread corporate hiring freezes, housing markets grinding to a halt due to sustained high interest rates, and companies just shelving major technological investments.
Right.
And as for our resilience, well, the IMF firmly warns that we are actually in a much more fragile position today, precisely because of how we survived the pandemic shock.
Meaning governments have already emptied their emergency coffers.
Exactly. The report specifically highlights severely eroded fiscal buffers. Over the last few years, governments spent unprecedented amounts of money to protect their citizens.
Right. They subsidized energy bills, offered corporate tax breaks, sent direct stimulus checks.
Yes, and by doing so, public debt absolutely soared. So the vast majority of governments simply do not have the financial firepower or the borrowing capacity, really, to absorb another 200% energy spike. The safety net is gone.
Wow. And the IMF indicates that this vulnerability is not distributed equally either.
No, not at all. Vulnerable commodity-importing developing economies are absorbing the most brutal impact here. They are hit by a devastating double blow.
How so?
Well, first, they're paying significantly more for the energy they need to import. And second, global uncertainty causes international investors to flee to safe haven assets, predominantly the U.S. dollar.
Right, which artificially inflates the value of the dollar while tanking the value of developing nations' currencies.
Exactly.
So they have to buy oil, which is priced in U.S. dollars, right?
Yeah.
Using local currency that buys significantly less than it did just 3 months ago.
It is an agonizing dynamic for those countries. And this pervasive sense of threat across the board is driving a massive structural reaction from governments worldwide.
Yeah.
The sudden economic shocks of the Middle East conflict are basically acting as a catalyst for a calculated, widespread surge in global defense spending.
So if governments have depleted their emergency funds, like you said, and they're staring down slower global growth, how on earth are they affording these massive military buildups?
That's the billion-dollar question. To understand the macroeconomic consequences of this pivot, the IMF compiled a historical data set covering 164 countries dating all the way back to 1946.
Wow, that's a lot of data.
It is. And they found that currently half the world is actively increasing their military budgets. Historically, an average defense boom lasts just over 2.5 years and adds about 2.7 percentage points of GDP to national defense outlays.
That is a colossal reallocation of resources.
Massive.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. How does spending billions on military readiness actually impact the broader economy? Because, building naval ships, hiring aerospace engineers, opening munitions factories, it sounds a lot like a giant government-funded jobs program.
Well, in the short term, it absolutely acts as a stimulus. The IMF report explains that defense spending operates as a targeted demand shock. They calculate an economic multiplier of roughly 1.
Okay, what does that mean in plain English?
It means for every dollar a government spends on defense, the overall economy grows by about $1. It lifts consumption and drives private investment within defense-adjacent sectors.
Right, but it's a one-to-one return. It doesn't trigger a cascading wave of secondary prosperity. The factory workers get paid, the economy ticks upward momentarily, but it comes with a catch.
A huge catch. The critical issue is the financing. Historically, roughly 2/3 of a defense boom is financed by deficits.
They're borrowing the money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Governments are borrowing the money to fund this stimulus. As a result, public debt jumps by about 7% within just 3 years of the initial buildup.
Ramping up defense spending like this is essentially like putting a state-of-the-art security system for your house on a high-interest credit card.
Exactly.
In the short term, you feel incredibly secure. The technicians who install the cameras get paid, the hardware store makes a profit that is your immediate economic boost. But 3 years later, you're looking at your credit card statement, and the monthly interest payments are completely devouring your grocery budget. You purchased security, but you sacrificed your long-term financial health to achieve it.
That perfectly illustrates the macroeconomic trade-off. And it becomes even more complicated for nations that do not possess domestic defense industries, because as they spend more on military readiness, their imports surge, causing their current account balances to deteriorate.
Let me pause you there. For those of us who don't read central bank ledgers for fun, you're basically saying that more money is bleeding out of the country to buy foreign weapons than is coming in from regular trade, correct?
That is exactly the dynamic. They are exporting their wealth to import military hardware.
Wow.
And the IMF also draws a stark line between a defense boom during peacetime and a defense boom during an active war. In peacetime, a defense buildup can boost output without necessarily crushing other public sectors. But in a wartime boom, the math changes entirely.
It's the classic guns versus butter dilemma.
It really is. And the trade-off becomes absolutely brutal. The report documents that in wartime, national debt skyrockets by 14% of GDP.
14.
Yeah. And to manage this, governments enact severe real-term cuts to social spending. Funding for education, civilian infrastructure, and healthcare is essentially hollowed out to keep the military machinery running.
Man, we have spent a lot of time discussing the staggering cost of preparing for conflict. But the most sobering section of the IMF's analysis measures the true historical cost when a conflict actually erupts on a nation's soil.
Yeah, the IMF refers to these as the macroeconomic scars of war. And the data is incredibly persistent across their historical timeline. 5 years after a conflict begins, the affected country's capital stock, meaning its factories, its bridges, commercial infrastructure, is down 4% compared to pre-war projections.
In employment.
Employment remains depressed by 3%.
How exactly does that collapse work on a structural level, though? Like, what's actually happening on the ground?
Well, it's a simultaneous collapse of both supply and demand. On the supply side, you have the physical destruction of the economy's ability to produce. Infrastructure is bombed, supply chains are severed, and the labor force is completely displaced.
Right, people flee.
Exactly. And then on the demand side, paralyzing uncertainty takes over. Even in areas physically untouched by the fighting, households hoard cash and stop spending on anything beyond absolute necessities.
Because they don't know what tomorrow looks like.
Right. And businesses freeze all hiring and capital investment because they cannot forecast what the country will even look like next quarter.
So what does this all mean for you? If you are listening to this from a peaceful nation, thousands of miles away from an active conflict, it is so tempting to view these statistics as an abstract tragedy happening to someone else.
It is, but the mechanisms of global finance and trade ensure those scars eventually spread.
Exactly. When a regional economy collapses, you see immediate capital outflows. Domestic and foreign investors panic. They sell off local assets, moving their money to safe havens. This crashes the local currency and destabilizes the broader geographic region. You see millions of displaced people seeking refuge, which fundamentally alters the political and economic resources of neighboring countries. And, like we saw with the Strait of Hormuz, the destruction of infrastructure in one part of the world immediately spikes the cost of the energy heating your home.
Which brings us to the recovery phase. This raises an important question. How do countries ever recover from this depth of structural damage? Because the historical data clearly demonstrates that even when a ceasefire is signed, recoveries are painfully slow.
And if they relapse?
If a country relapses into conflict, the economic recovery stalls out entirely.
The IMF notes that you can't just, rebuild a damaged bridge, hand out some relief funds, and expect the economy to magically restart. Piecemeal policies fail. So what does a successful recovery actually look like in practice?
It requires an overwhelming, comprehensive package of interventions. The IMF heavily stresses the need for early macroeconomic stabilization,
Meaning what?
meaning international institutions must step in to halt hyperinflation and stabilize the currency so citizens can afford basic necessities. And crucially, it requires decisive debt restructuring.
Because these countries emerged from war carrying the massive deficits they incurred to fight it in the first place.
Yeah, precisely. You cannot just forgive a margin of interest and call it a day. International creditors must be brought to the table to systematically write down the principal debt.
Wow, the principle itself.
Yes. Otherwise, the recovering nation is spending all of its international aid merely servicing old wartime loans rather than rebuilding its capital stock. Without immense coordinated international support, the macroeconomic scars harden into permanent features of the economy.
We have covered a tremendous amount of ground today. We started by examining the physical bottleneck at the Strait of Hormuz, unpacking how a single geographical choke point can freeze the global supply chain and send inflation spiking worldwide.
Right. And we analyzed the IMF's increasingly severe economic scenarios, detailing how the erosion of our fiscal buffers over the last few years leaves us highly vulnerable to a sustained energy shock.
We decoded the mechanics of the current global defense boom, revealing that the short-term economic stimulus of military spending is ultimately financed by long-term deficits that act as a drag on national wealth.
And finally, we confronted the lasting scars of conflict, the dual collapse of supply and demand, and the complex international interventions required to reconstruct a shattered economy.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final concept to mull over. As we digest the IMF's stark projections, it appears we may be crossing a threshold here. Geopolitical instability, fractured supply chains, and sweeping defense budgets are no longer temporary anomalies.
No.
They are becoming the structural foundation of the new normal.
Which forces a total reevaluation of how global markets function.
Exactly. If this is the new reality, will the fundamental way we measure a healthy economy have to evolve? Are we entering an era where the next generation will simply have to accept a permanent security premium baked into the price of the food they eat, the energy they use, and the goods they buy?
It's very possible.
Perhaps true global prosperity in the future will not be defined by how fast we can grow, but by how well we can absorb the next inevitable shock.
It's a massive paradigm shift that every policymaker and citizen will have to navigate.
Thank you for taking this deep dive with us. We know your time is incredibly valuable, and we appreciate you spending it here, digging into the mechanisms that shape our world so you can navigate it as a more deeply informed citizen.